I read somewhere years ago that Montana is Spanish for mountain or mountainous. As a native of eastern Montana, I'd venture to guess that Mr. Ashley, the man who suggested this name for our fair state, never traveled east of Billings. If he had, he wouldn't have seen anything resembling a mountain. What Mr. Ashley would have seen instead is a fraternal twin to its other half, a rolling expanse of land that shares little or nothing with its western sibling besides the same birth date. While western Montana rises up like the front end of a head-on collision with Idaho, our half lies quietly dramatic, its treeless knolls and dry gullies twisting and rippling for miles in every direction. Carter County, my county, forms the far southeastern corner, sprawling like an old wool blanket spread carelessly across the ground, complete with ridges, wrinkles, hollows, and an occasional hole. The closest thing Carter County can claim to a mountain is the Buttes, a series of sandstone flat tops that look like the beginnings of a mountain, as though some ambitious fellow came along and started building a mountain range but didn't have the energy to finish. The Finger Buttes cross the county at an angle, south to northwest, like giant stones laid out to keep the wind from blowing the blanket away. But back to Mr. Ashley. I understand his mistake. He had obvious reasons. For one thing, Montana is a damn fine name. A noble-sounding name that rings especially full and rich when spoken by a man with a deep voice and a steady character. Someone calm and patient enough to linger on the ends so that the word hums slightly. And it's impossible to deny that the mountains surrounding cluttering western Montana are magnificent. Maybe the only creation that can crowd into the perfection of a blue sky and improve on it. But despite all that, I prefer the prairie, mainly because I've lived my whole life here, of course. There's more to it than that. When I finally had a chance to see the Rocky Mountains, they affected me in a way I didn't expect. I was still a young man, 23 to be exact. My older brother Jack and I drove to Bozeman in the spring of 1925 to buy some oak flooring for the big house my folks were building. On that clear spring day, we rounded the curve into the Bozeman Pass, and I'd never seen anything so beautiful. There the mountains sat, blue, purple, and surprising, like two black eyes. Up until then, I had not seen ground any higher than the Black Hills. My glances at the sky were brief, just long enough to figure out what kind of weather we could expect. So my neck wasn't used to holding my head at the angle required. Jack and I stared for 15 minutes, rotating, squinting into the bright sun, shading our eyes. We paid the price later, with necks so stiff we had to sleep without pillows. But it was well worth it. We decided to get closer, so we drove until the two-rut road ended, gawking, saying little. Then we climbed from the flatbed and stared a while longer. "Let's climb the damn thing," I said. Jack, in a rare moment of skepticism, peered up at the rising slope, his eyes small and dark. It looked as if we could reach out and brush our hands across the tops of the trees. "I don't know, Blake. I think it's a little further than it looks." "Ah, come on, let's climb." Jack gave in, but he proved to be right. Just as our necks weren't used to bending backward, our legs weren't prepared for ground that pushed back. We didn't make it far before we had to rest our cramping calves. I could barely breathe. I began to feel a little stifled up there. I panted hard as we kneaded our aching muscles. I don't know if there's a special shoe for this type of thing, but if there is, I bet it doesn't look anything like a cowboy boot, I said. Jack laughed, and although his smile quickly faded, he seemed more relaxed than he had in years. Something about being up in the middle of those trees seemed to affect him in a different way than it did me. And for a brief moment, I thought about asking him about all the things I always wanted to know. About the Army, and the years he had disappeared, and about his wife, Rita. I wanted to know about his intentions for the ranch. Now that he was the oldest, he was the natural heir. But because he'd spent so much time away, I had much more invested. I wanted to know whether he planned to take over when Dad and Mom couldn't take care of the place anymore. I sure felt like I had a case for taking over the ranch myself, but we had never discussed the possibility, just as we had never discussed any of this with our father. For that tiny moment, that conversation seemed possible. But I hesitated. And that was all the time it took for those small dark eyes to narrow and for his thin lips to purse. He sighed and he looked away, and I could feel him drift, and I knew it was too late. I turned my attention to the view. We could see nothing but trees except far in the distance where rolling farmland stretched out in patches of green and brown. It was beautiful in a different way from our own ranch. The colors were darker, the landscape had more abrupt angles. It wasn't much longer before Jack suggested we head on into Bozeman. In town, we argued about where to stay. Jack thought we ought to treat ourselves to a room at the Grand Hotel, the most expensive place in town. We can't spend that kind of money, I said. Mom would kill us. Jack frowned. What are you going to do, squeal? How's she going to know? Come on, let's live it up for once. How many chances are we going to get? I was too intimidated to put up a fight, knowing Jack would get surly. But I could hardly look at my parents for the next 2 weeks, especially when Jack told them a bold-faced lie about how much money we spent. That night in Bozeman, as I lay in that fancy hotel room, something about the day gnawed at me. Something besides the ache in my muscles, or the argument with Jack, or the money. I tossed through a couple of sleepless hours before I figured out what it was. It finally struck me when I imagined being back home, standing at the top of a divide, looking at the circle of open space, the miles and miles of grass around me. I realized that the mountains just don't give you much. You hike a ways, and the trees are thick as hair around you, so you walk a few painful yards further. Maybe you find a small clearing and can see a little further. Even at the top, you might be able to see forever, but everything is miles away. That's what bothered me about it, and it still does. I realized that the lack of breath I experienced halfway up that mountain was not just the result of the climb. I felt closed in, smothered up there with so little space around me. I didn't like not being able to see what was coming or where we'd been. And I know that if I lived in mountain country, I could never love the land around me like I do my own. That night, I figured out why people like me fall in love with the prairie, even as brutal and unforgiving as it can be. Because when the earth spreads itself out in front of you like that, completely vulnerable, completely naked, you simply can't help yourself. So that's the beginning of my first novel. And I like to read that because it's an indication of how I felt about Montana when I first started writing. I was actually in Boston when I wrote this, in grad school. And so I had, I'd been away for a while, and I had this image of Montana in my head that was based in large part because this is based on my mother's family in Carter County. So we spent a lot of time at the ranch. And I had these, sort of idealistic ideas about what it was like and how much that was representative of what Montana is. And so that book came out, and I was living in San Francisco, and somewhere along the line, not too long after that came out, my uncle, who was my godfather and sort of one of my mentors, he suggested to me one time, he said, "You should go to every county in Montana and write a book about it." And I thought, wow, that would be awesome. But, I was living in San Francisco, so it wasn't a real practical idea. But I was also dating this woman who was an editor, and I told her about it. And she said, nobody would buy that book. So I kind of took her at her word. I thought she knew what she was talking about. But when I moved back to Billings in 2007, this idea kept coming back to me because, and part of the reason was because I, came back to Montana. I'd been gone for 25 years by that time. And I realized I didn't know the state nearly as well as I thought I did. I heard people talk about whatever issues, and I was pretty out of touch with what's going on here. And of course, also, I hadn't really seen a lot of the state, big chunks of it. So that idea, wouldn't leave. I kept thinking about it, and but I obviously also knew that it would be it'd be a big job, a lot of work, a lot of time. But I had a friend, this guy who published one of my novels. I told him about it, and he says, "Oh, I would publish that book in a heartbeat." So that guy, I owe him a lot. He agreed to publish it without, I hadn't written a word yet. So anyway, I started my journey, and when I did a tour of the state in 4 big loops. I started with the western part, then I did the High Line, went up through the middle and up around the High Line and came back down through Glendive and that way. Then I did the middle of the state, and then finally I did the southeast corner. And I, interviewed people all over the place, and started reading a lot about the history, and had all this material, and I didn't know what to do. I was kind of unsure about how to shape this thing, So I tried writing about each county, and boy, that was boring. You guys would have been bored to tears as you read that one. It was like a travel guide. That was not exactly what I had in mind. So then I decided, well, okay, I'm going to try following the path that I traveled. So I started doing that. That didn't work either because you guys know the counties in Montana, even the ones next to each other, are very different. There wasn't a lot of continuity there. That wasn't going to work either. So finally what I decided to try was breaking it up into chapters according to industry. So there's a chapter on the railroad, there's a chapter on farming, a chapter on ranching, and then timber, mining, can't remember what else, but anyway. And I also didn't know that once I started writing, that I was going to end up putting a lot of our personal story, our family history, into this book. So, yeah, it was a really cool process. Just trying to figure out how to do it, and once I got that notion in my head that that was the best way to approach it, it came pretty quickly, and it was an amazing experience. I got to know a lot of incredible people. As you guys know, there's no shortage of those in Montana. So I'm going to read the introduction and a couple more short passages, and then hopefully you guys will have some amazing questions to ask. I have a secret to share with you. It's about this whole Montana mystique, the magic of this place. I've lived in 12 different states in the past 30 years, and I've always been amazed by how people respond when they hear you're from Montana. Not always, of course. Some people don't even know where it is. They sometimes know it's near Canada, and others see it as just another small part of that big empty space between New York and California. But I often come across people who say, "Oh, I love Montana. Have you been there?" "No, but it looks so beautiful in the pictures. I've always wanted to go." And of course there are the inevitable questions, sometimes entirely baffling. A friend of mine was recently asked, "Do you guys have grocery stores there?" Yeah. Montana is a place where vast expanses are really impossible to comprehend until you've been here. I was recently talking to someone who works at the wind farms in Wheatland County, and he told me about the owner of the company coming to visit the work site. He said he would catch a cab from the airport in Billings. I said, I don't think you want to do that. So he asked me whether there was a train. I said, no, I'll tell you what, I'll just come and pick you up. Another friend tells a story about when they first moved to Montana and they had to drive to Great Falls for business. This guy was giving me directions and he said, turn left at Eddie's Corner. And I asked him what that was and he said, oh, it's a gas station. And I thought, wait, I'm driving 200 miles to get to this town and I'm supposed to pick out one gas station and know where to turn? But of course, when I got to Eddie's Corner, it made complete sense. For decades, the West, and Montana in particular, has developed a reputation as a place where you can start over, to create a whole new persona, or become the person you always envisioned. It's the kind of place where a week-long trip to one of the more picturesque locales fuels the imagination. The fresh air, the huge sky, and the wide open space instills in you a belief that anything is possible. It's a place where starting over can move from concept to reality in the course of a walk around Bozeman or a drive along Flathead Lake. But here's the secret. The secret is that we Montanans are completely bipolar. That's right, we're up and down like a goddamn bucking horse. Not all of us, of course, but as a state, as one big entity, we are completely manic depressive. Why do I say that? Well, in February of 2014, Gallup did a survey to determine the happiest states in America. Montana finished #1. That's the idea you get when you visit this place. People are so friendly. They really do seem happy. You rarely get that shiver up your neck where the friendliness seems to be hiding some slimy ulterior motive. I think this has actually changed since then. People in Montana let you go first because it doesn't matter whether they go first. They smile at you on the street because there's no good reason not to. But here's the other side of it. That same year, 2014, several studies listed Montana in the top 3 for suicide. For the last 40 years, we've been in the top 5 every single year. So what the hell does that mean? How is that possible? How can a place that's the happiest in the whole country, what? Well, that's one of the many things I want to address in this book. For one thing, there's an inherent pressure when you live in Montana to be happy. Seriously, if you can't be happy here, what the hell is wrong with you? But of course, it's way more complicated than that. Much of the explanation goes back to the very beginning, when Montana first came into being, or at least the current form, when it was settled. From the start, the narrative about our history has been altered, or often completely rewritten in order to support the actions of certain people, or certain groups of people. From the start, those who wrote our history were so intent on shining a bright light on Montana that they ignored many of the pertinent facts, particularly the shadows. And perhaps the most troubling aspect of this is that many of those who wrote or made movies about the West, particularly about Montana, didn't even live here. Oh, that hasn't changed at all. From the time Owen Wister came out with The Virginian, which is considered the first great Western, writers have been presenting the stereotypical Westerner as stoic, self-contained, multi-talented, and completely cool under pressure. But Wister was a lawyer from back east, a law school friend of Teddy Roosevelt who came west a few times as a rich tourist. The American West was built around these misconceptions and misdirection. And although most of us who live here know this by now, especially after decades of wonderful historians and journalists digging deep enough to tell the real story, many of these misconceptions persist. Not only here, but worldwide, because they have become an important part of the American culture. They justify certain behaviors. They romanticize this idea that men who ride into town and take care of business are the kind of men we need. The number of American presidents and other world leaders who have posed on horses or in various Western activities is hilarious and frightening. From Reagan chopping firewood to Putin sitting shirtless in the saddle, leaders have found ways to align themselves with this old Western mentality, and it seems to work. It tells the public, I am a man of action. I can handle an axe, and I look good on a horse. Look at Teddy. He was actually known as the cowboy president. He not only relished that image, but he perpetuated it, partly because it was based on fact, because he lived here for a while. But there was a dark side to Theodore Roosevelt's time out west, and that contradiction fits right in with our whole bipolar history. Roosevelt moved here and built a cattle ranch when he was still in his 20s, after he lost both his wife and his mother on the very same day in the same house from completely unrelated ailments. He spent the next several years immersing himself in a world of physical labor, raising cattle and hunting like a fiend. The number of animals Roosevelt killed in his time out west is estimated in the thousands. It doesn't take a professional to figure out there was probably some element of escapism there. Roosevelt never mentioned his wife's name again as long as he lived, even in his autobiography. So you could say it worked for him, but none of us will ever know how much pain he buried over those tragic events. It could very well be what drove him to accomplish as much as he did. It's well documented that he was a man who couldn't sit still. Many wonderful journalists and historians have told this story before, and this is intended as just one more contribution to the growing narrative of this place. It's just one man's take on the contradictions and complexities that are Montana. Because a story this big and this complicated needs to be told over and over again. Okay, this is a little part that talks about the difference between western and eastern Montana. There is a difference, as you might have noticed. There is no line marking the change from western Montana to eastern Montana. Whether you're driving along Highway 2 from Kalispell to Cut Bank, or traveling east along Highway 90 from Bozeman, you won't see a sign that says, "Welcome to Eastern Montana." But you will notice a difference. I used to say that Eastern Montana was flat until I married a woman from Savannah, Georgia. When I brought her to Montana and we drove across the eastern part of the state, she said, "This isn't flat. This isn't flat at all." I didn't quite grasp how she could say that until we did a similar road trip through Georgia. Of course, she was right. Although there are definitely long stretches, especially on the High Line, where you can see for miles, the terrain in eastern Montana is almost never flat. There are subtle changes everywhere. You can drive for hours without seeing so much as a handful of trees also, and those are generally shelter belts. But a closer look at this half of the state reveals a land that is rich with texture. Whether it's a long, delicate slope or a hidden coulee, there are indications everywhere that the elements have been hard at work. There are also moments of absolute magnificence, like the Badlands in Makoshika State Park, which resemble the Southwest more than Montana, and the Absaroka or Crazy Mountains, which give almost every other range in the state a decent run for the most scenic mountain range. There are the sandstone cliffs and the Medicine Rocks State Park near Ekalaka. I can't forget the sheer beauty of the lakes in the Bighorn Mountains, east and west Rosebud. This variety of geological formations and makeup is part of what makes this state unique. But much of eastern Montana is an acquired taste, especially if you expect something like the majesty of the mountains. That kind of open country seems to attract two very different types of people. First, and create two kinds of towns. First, there's a town like Fort Benton. Ken knows that town very well. Where everywhere you go, people greet you like a long-lost relative. There are many towns like this in eastern Montana where the people appear to be living rich, happy lives. The other extreme is a little harder to grasp, and an outsider, I'm sure, it can be intimidating. In most of the smaller towns in eastern Montana, what you're going to encounter when you first walk into the local cafe is the stare. Those who encounter the stare should not panic. Although at first glance the stare suggests that you might want to turn around and go back to your car, the explanation is pretty simple. The stare comes from seeing the same 25 or 30 people day after day for the past 5 or 10 years. You're suddenly presented with someone they've never seen before. You're a specimen that needs to be studied and analyzed. The stare may seem rude at first, but it's really a compliment. You are exotic, worthy of examination. You are something they can spend a good hour talking about later. So, one of the things that I was really fascinated by as I got to know people around the state was that there's so much progressive stuff happening in the field of agriculture. And I met this couple in Baker, who are organic farmers, and they've been doing it for way longer than most people who talk about that. So this is about them. Dead, 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 dead. Fallon County farmer Jerry Sikorsky points toward a cement-colored field that belongs to one of his neighbors. You see the color of that ground? See how dull it is? That's because all the nutrients are gone. It has no soil health. Jerry shook his head. I know, I'm obsessed with this stuff. Okay, now look here at this. He bent down and dug into the soil at our feet, scooping a handful from the hole. He held it to his own nose, the hands looking cartoon-like next to his normal-sized head. And then he poured some into my hand. Smell that, he said. The soil looked like chocolate cake, almost black, with a firm but tender texture. It smelled alive, as fresh as prairie rainstorms. See what I'm saying, Jerry said? He broke the soil apart, revealing an intricate network of tiny roots. If you put that under a microscope, he said, you'd find thousands of tiny little bugs and organisms of all kinds, because that's what gives it that kind of life, that kind of health. It was striking, driving across one of Sikorsky's farm fields, how the ground felt more like a golf course than most farm or ranch land. Normally, driving over a pasture or a field, especially in eastern Montana, is a bit like riding a roller coaster with bumps and dips that you often don't see coming, and that sometimes send you careening against the window. I like to plant crossways every year, too. One year I'll go north and south, the next year I'll go east and west. It levels out the land. Over the course of many years, Jerry has devised a unique strategy for farming that involves no cultivation at all, constant experimentation with crop rotation, planting cover crops, and even planting small sections of pollination crops, designed for the sole purpose of attracting more bugs. Jerry's a big believer in generating the whole process of interaction between insects, animals, and crops. He even leaves a wide swath of wheat unmown every time he harvests so that the insects and critters have something to feed on. So what's this guy's story? Is he some hippie from California who moved to Montana with a trunk full of loopy ideas? Or is he one of these trust fund babies who had the money to get a graduate degree in agriculture and decided to buck decades worth of solid experience? Actually, neither of these is remotely true. Jerry was born and raised on this very farm, 15 miles south of Baker, the county seat. He's a Vietnam vet, a man who served in the National Guard for 20 years as a helicopter pilot. And he moved back to the farm as a young man and has never left. He's completely self-taught, although if you suggest that to him, he'll dismiss it. I've been to a lot of talks and conferences through the years. Jerry, it seems, has had many mentors. Jerry's grandfather homesteaded this piece of land in 1911. He came to Montana from Minnesota after, after migrating first from Poland. Jerry's dad was one of 7 kids, 5 boys and 2 girls. And as with most families in those days, he went through a complicated and sometimes contentious competition with his siblings before he emerged with the farm. One of my few questions that brought Jerry to a silent halt was, how did they get through the Depression? Jerry has an amusing habit of chewing on his tongue. And this question really got his jaw going. He apparently doesn't chew very hard because there's no sign of blood, but he gnawed on it constantly. You know, I really should know more about that, he said. I know they did pretty well, because they came out of the Depression with more land than when they went in, but I have no idea how they got through it. Eventually, his father married and had 5 boys. Jerry was the youngest. Although there was nothing remarkable about the farm when he was a kid, they managed to survive, and his father showed us some flashes of innovation, including being one of the first in that era to incorporate, which he did in 1956. Ironically, this decision ended up turning on Jerry's father when he got involved with a younger woman, and Jerry's mom, along with the rest of the family, voted Dad out of the corporation. Okay, one more. What time have I got here? Yeah. This is basically the end. Doesn't give anything away. So. Montana has so much beauty. One look at some of the splendor that exists in this place, and you find yourself searching for words. And it's not just the landscape. What is most beautiful about this place is the spirit of it. The way the people here love the land so hard and so thoroughly, whether it's the land or their families or their country, they love until it makes them blind, until they feel the need to barricade themselves against anything that threatens that love. They love with hearts so full that the blood can pump up and swell their view of themselves. The vast openness of this place can inspire your imagination until you believe you can accomplish anything. I've often driven along the eastern part of the state and thought about how riding across this country on a horse for weeks at a time could have given the imagination of someone like George Armstrong Custer so much time in the room that it blew up beyond the boundaries of any rational mind. Many people don't realize that part of what inspired Custer to make his harebrained charge was his growing ambition to become president. He had many people urging him to run, based on, in large part, on his conquests in battle. So he was hoping to add one more big victory to his resume. Despite the fact that his company had a desertion rate of well over 50%, he was living in a world where he was invincible, an unconquerable hero. Montana is a place that will not let go of you. I moved away in 1996. And for many years after that, I kept renewing my Montana license plates, even though I moved around to several different states. I was always so proud when somebody asked me about it or gave me a thumbs up from their own car. When I was living in San Francisco, someone once left a note on my windshield saying he was from Bozeman and he'd like to meet this fellow Montanan. So I dropped by his house, and he really grilled me about the license plates. He wouldn't let it go. I eventually realized he was jealous. He wanted Montana license plates. Some of the best quotes about Montana capture this idea, and they're not wrong. The most famous is John Steinbeck's, "I'm in love with Montana. For other states I have admiration, respect, recognition, even some affection. But with Montana it is love." But my own favorite Steinbeck's quote about Montana is, "Montana seems to me to be what a small boy would think Texas is like after listening to someone from Texas." Over time, Montana has inspired writers and artists to honor not only the myths, but also the truth. It makes for an interesting dynamic. So I guess the final question becomes whether or not I found what I was looking for on this journey. Did I find an idea of what Montana represents, what it means to me or to anyone? And to answer to that, I'll turn to two final stories. When I was working on my grandfather's ranch when I was 16, my uncle and I were moving a flock of sheep when one of the lambs broke free. This was early in my time there, so I was ready to prove my worth as well as my skill on a horse. I took off after that little guy, digging my heels deep into the horse's flanks. But when I caught up to the lamb, he abruptly stopped, ran behind the horse, and then took off again. I caught up to him 2 more times before I finally got it through my head that it wasn't working. I probably yelled something nasty at him, then turned my horse around and started trotting back toward the flock. And of course, when I turned around to see whether he was still running, he was following me back to the flock. A couple of days before I finished this book, I watched an 80-year-old woman fall and land hard on the back of her head. She was using a walker, and when she landed, the walker flipped over and hit her in the face. It was horrific, unfolding just 10 feet from where I stood, and it brought up the worst feelings of helplessness and fear. The hardest part was that this woman was my mother. We had just finished running some tests at the hospital where we had spent about 3 hours shuttling from room to room. They fit her with an IV and gave her some kind of drug to simulate physical activity so they could take pictures of her heart and determine whether she was strong enough for surgery. The tests had gone well, and they took less time than we had anticipated. But she was tired and a little weak from walking more than she usually does. Just before she fell, a man had picked up a form that had fallen from her walker. She was in the process of putting it into the fold-up seat on her walker when I showed her where to sit in the waiting room while I went for the car. This combination of things led to her losing her balance, doing a slight pirouette, and falling slightly, straight backwards, landing flat on her back. My mother and I have sometimes had a difficult relationship. We've often gone for long stretches without talking. But it's always been me that initiated this silence. And once, she never stopped talking to me. And each time I decided to talk to her again, she replied without the slightest hesitation. Perhaps because of this past, this incident affected me deeply, and as I left her at the hospital that night, where they had admitted her again to make sure there were no internal damages, I broke into tears thinking about the look of terror on her face as she fell. I couldn't stop crying. I felt as if there were so many things I could have done to prevent this. If I had recognized how tired she was, I could have asked for a wheelchair, or if I had just stayed with her for those 10 more feet that she needed to walk to the waiting room. But mainly if I had just had the presence of mind to slow down and notice what was happening. Mothers are amazing in the way they forgive and still offer what they can. And I can't help but think about the fact that this place we live in is referred to as Mother Earth. I can't help but wonder whether we don't take enough time to slow down and notice how forgiving she can be, no matter how much we ignore her warnings. Like most animals, we are fairly simple beings when it comes right down to it. Some food, a place to lay our heads, a sense of usefulness. It's the world around us that complicates these things. and there are few places that are as complicated as Montana. There are also few places that provide as many opportunities. And when you think about the things we do to utilize those resources, just the verbs themselves indicate a sense of abuse, even violence. We plow, we corral, we break, we excavate, we herd, we cut, and we drill. We cultivate, herd, dam, pluck, and hobble. There are so many things that happen every day, hour after hour, that prove in some small way that we have very little control over what happens in our lives. But when the health and safety of someone we love is affected by this kind of powerlessness, it brings home the most basic rule of life, that we are small, insignificant dancers in a very complex and chaotic ballet. But when you live in a place like this, you also eventually learn the futility of trying to tame these elements. You learn that a lamb running from the flock isn't the end of the world, that you aren't going to stop it from doing what it wants to do. You learn that no matter how hard you try to protect the ones you love, they will sometimes fall. And finally, you learn that the best way of getting what you want is by recognizing that we are only temporary guests here, stewards of this place, and that by treating it and its inhabitants with the respect they deserve, we improve our chances of having them come to us. Hi.
Hi.
Any questions?
I'll ask you a
Yes.
question. Talk a little bit about your writing process. You've written a number of books. How do you get the ideas? I know each person is different. And
Yeah,
are you writing something now?
I'm always writing something. Yeah, the ideas always seem to come in just weird, unexpected ways. I wrote one book based on a story that this woman friend of mine told me about trying to catch this drunk guy, and when she was 12, this big guy was about to fall on her and somebody pulled her out of the way. And I wrote a whole novel based on branching out from that. So yeah, it's always kind of fun and mysterious what's going to happen and where it's going to come from. As far as my process, I do a lot of other things. I have a radio show and I've been writing a blog lately too. So I try to do my busy work first and then do my writing in the afternoon. That's usually when I do the best work.
And where is your blog, if people want to follow you?
It's called, well, it's a Substack, if you
Yeah.
know what Substack is. So it's, I guess, Russell Rowland Substack. I'm not sure exactly what the,
And your podcast is?
My podcast is also on the Substack, and that's called The State of Montana. It's, I've been doing a radio show based on this book for 5 years, I think, and it's been fun, but it kind of it's limiting as far as being able to really voice my opinion about stuff, especially politics. So I started the podcast to get a little more politically involved, and that's been a lot of fun. I just interviewed Ken Toole this afternoon, so that was fun. Yeah,
Where do you call home?
I'm in Billings.
You're in Billings. And another question, totally another question.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to take your laps around Montana?
Yeah, I should know that. I kind of did it over the course of a year, and I don't know exactly how much time I devoted to the trip itself. There was a lot of things I wasn't thinking. I didn't even keep track of how many miles I went. That was, even later I thought, why didn't I think of that, Yeah.
So did you travel all seasons, kind of? Or
Yeah, I didn't, I'm like most of us, I don't like driving in the winter too much. So I was mostly spring and fall, a little bit of summer. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. excuse me for being a little lost here, but I left my hearing aids at home.
Oh, okay.
So I caught snippets here and there. Was one of your published books your master's thesis?
Yeah, this one.
That one,
It was.
okay. And my next question would be, did a editor or an agent ever suggest that if you would write about Boston or Connecticut, you might have more marketable books than if you wrote about Montana?
You know, I tried that. Actually, when I was in grad school, which was in Boston, I was trying to write, you know, like most of the writers who were getting published then, and, you know, just didn't click until I started writing Montana stories.
I understand, that was your heart,
Yeah,
but the readers at the book publishing houses
yeah,
and the editors of the New York Times Book Review, they know Boston and Connecticut better than they do Montana.
yeah. I can't write for those guys.
You can't write for them.
Yeah.
So Russell, one of the things I love about your Substack, and even before that, just on your Facebook page, was the art.
Oh,
Yes.
You find that and put that out. I mean, that's just a lovely way to start a day,
yeah.
or to whenever I happen to find it. So tell me more about that.
Well, it's not a very interesting story. I mean, I had a Facebook friend who was posting like 10 paintings every morning, and I just liked, you know, I liked the art he was choosing, so I just started picking one from the ones that he posted and posting it every morning. And I was kind of shocked. I mean, a lot of people that I meet in person now from Facebook, that's the first thing they say. It's nothing about my writing. Oh, I love your paintings. Oh, this is a hilarious story. I have this friend who has a gallery in Missoula, Lisa Simon, the Radius Gallery. Some of you might have been there. So I was in there one day talking to her, and she says, "Oh, this guy came in the other day, this collector that I know. He says, you know who you should represent is Russell Rowland." She said, "You mean the writer?" And he goes, "Oh no, he's a painter. He's really good." So this guy who was a collector, you know, I don't know, he somehow thought I was doing all these paintings. I would be very talented to do that. But, yes, Ken?
So when you made the tour,
Yeah.
let's say along the High Line, and you arrived in Liberty County, what did you do? How did you capture the essence of Chester and Liberty County and
Yeah.
High Line?
I just stood in the middle of the street and waited for things to happen. No, I always went to the museum first. Well, not always. First I like to drive around and just look for interesting things. But I always went to the museum, and of course those volunteers were incredible as far as giving me ideas about what to go see and who to talk to. So they were, you know, incredible resource as far as pointing me in the right direction. And I have to tell a funny story about driving around. So when I pulled into Plentywood, you know, this was my first time on the High Line. And, you know, you guys probably know, it's pretty boring. And there's, you know, everything kind of looks the same. Each county is pretty much the same. So, and I was starting to get a little paranoid for some reason. I don't know why, but I was. And like 2 nights before, I'd watched this movie, this old Spencer Tracy movie called Bad Day at Black Rock. Has anyone seen that movie? It's a great movie, but it's about this guy who shows up in this dinky little town, and the people just, you know, are acting really strange, especially when they find out who he's there looking for. And anyway, I watched, that was a bad idea to watch that movie while I was going along the High Line, because it made my paranoia even worse. So I pull into Plentywood, and the minute I pull into town, I'm driving around, suddenly there's a black truck following me. So I thought, oh, you know, it must be so So I start turning. Every time I turn, he turns. I was like, oh, jeez. So I finally decided, well, let's just get it over with. So I pulled into a parking lot. He pulls in. Roll down my window. He pulls right up next to me, rolls down his window. Your right rear tire is low. So that was a great Montana. Like, okay, I'm in Montana. I forgot, I'm still in Montana.
So Russell, tell me, when you were in Phillipsburg, over in
Yeah.
Granite County and where I grew up,
Oh.
tell me what you found there. I mean,
Well, my favorite part of Phillipsburg was the B&B I stayed in, which was called,
Was it the Caledonia?
no.
Oh,
Shoot, I wish I could think of the name.
It's on the right side as you're going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking
Yeah,
about. Yep.
and the husband and wife that ran this place.
Where are you coming from?
Yeah, on the right from this side.
It's on the south side of the main street when you go to Peters, on Broadway.
It's something cottage.
It is. They've got the books in there.
Yes,
Yes.
they have a great collection of Montana books in there.
Davy and Dave.
Davy and Dave, that's right, thank you so much. If I could just remember the name of the cottage now. But,
Is it Quigley Cottage?
yes, Quigley Cottage. Okay. We're a team, it takes a village.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, those two were amazing. I was the only one staying there for one thing, so I got all the royal treatment. But man, she made the most, I think it's still the best breakfast I've ever had in my life. It was so good. But yeah, that place, I don't think I'd ever been to Phillipsburg before. So that was one of the towns that really surprised me in a really good way. You know, they had a street dance the night I was there. This great jazz band was playing on the street. And yeah, fabulous. Yeah.
So, what was it, maybe 15 years ago when we talked about Great Falls and
Yeah.
you thought I was being a booster, but I was saying
Oh,
Great
yeah.
Falls after the
Right.
loss of the smelter and the rail repair yard and all the problems, we were
Yeah.
beginning to come back. It was a long process, but it was happening. I ask you today to, if you have time tomorrow, drive around a little bit, drive on the west side on 3rd Street Northwest and see the hotels and the restaurants and things going in. Drive down Main Street this evening and see there are actually cars parked along, in fact, you might have to walk a block and a half to get to the business you're going to. There's some restaurants and there's an increasing, there are very few vacant buildings, all of that's changing.
You're still trying to sell me, Ken, aren't you?
Go Ken, go
Are you
Ken.
talking about Central Avenue, Ken?
Yeah.
Great trend.
That's good. It's good to hear.
Question.
Yes.
How has it been different, the reaction to your books or 56 counties from people who from Montana or people who've never been to Montana?
That's a good question. Well, I got a lot of emails telling me what I got wrong, which was great. I mean, I knew that was going to happen, so it didn't bother me. And of course, those were all Montana natives. Yeah, most of the people from out of state have been really complimentary and, you know, just thrilled to have something that gives them an idea what to expect here and what it's like. But yeah, it was fun having some of those email exchanges with people that I've got, what's Lewistown, Fergus County?
Yeah.
Yes.
I got that completely wrong apparently, according to one person. But, you know, we ended up having a really good discussion about it, and then I actually interviewed her for my radio show. She was an extension agent, so she was a great interview. So yeah, it's fun to engage with people about that stuff.
What was your most difficult region?
Oh. Well, it was interesting. It was one of the first places I went, and it was Kalispell, not surprising. I went to Norm's News, and on the advice of I had stopped in at a senior center earlier. He said, oh, you gotta go to Norm's News, these guys meet for coffee there every morning. They're probably there now. So yeah, I went over there, and this group of guys, yeah, they were not friendly. I told them what I was doing, and they just, boy, they did not, it was weird. And I thought, well, shit, this is what I'm in for, you know. But that was the only place, really, that I ran into any kind of, you know, skepticism or...
Can you put your finger on perhaps why?
Yeah, I finally said, so what is the thing that you guys feel like is the biggest problem you're facing here right now? And the first guy, Obama.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I must have looked like a liberal or something.
So I just want to say, I love all your books, but Cold Country,
Oh,
I mean, that to me
Oh, great.
is just the best.
thank you.
Yes.
I have copies.
Yeah. I mean, I think, at one time, maybe they were thinking of doing a movie.
They were.
They were.
So yeah, I got a film option on that book right before COVID, and it was a pretty. I mean, it wasn't lucrative, but it was a pretty important person in the industry. So I got my hopes up, but yeah, COVID came, and then Yellowstone came.
Yeah.
And that book is set in the same place where Yellowstone is, so it was like.
Yeah. Boy, that's a
pretty
good
much
book.
killed. But yeah, that book was based on my dad took a job. It was actually not in Paradise Valley. I moved it. But it was in the Bighorn Valley in Wyoming. And yeah, it was just a tough 2 years. So that book is based on that 2-year stretch in our family's history.
Right.
Are we done? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. That was wonderful. I think that we all can say that we learned something and had a couple laughs this evening. Russell is going to be selling some of his books over here, so please feel free to purchase, and then he will sign them. I provided the Sharpies, so I'm hoping
I didn't say I was sorry.
Well, he is now. And just thank you all again for coming out. Please stay tuned for all of the fun things that we have going on at the library. Tomorrow night we have an art reception for the Great Falls Public School System. If you looked around at all when you walked in, there's a bunch of